Hi everyone. I thought today I was going to continue the sort of neurodiversity theme. I want to talk a little bit about sensory processing. What sensory processing is, how some kids are different. If your kid's a little different and unique, how can you still make your day go through, you know, all the motions without making yourselves crazy? Because this is something that I think we're just starting to recognize as a problem that is distinct from some of the other neurodiversity conditions, and it needs to be treated and addressed for the individual child. So let's back up for a second. Sensory processing is how you take data from the outside world and incorporate it into your knowledge and understanding of how the world works. So we typically talk about the five senses, right? Vision, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. There are a couple of other ones that we need to talk about though, because not all touch is the same. So light touch, or the touch that we have in our hands to explore things, is one sense. But the feeling of deep pressure is a completely different kind of touch. They're actually different neurons that conduct that impulse. So thinking about touch as exploration versus deep pressure and separating those two out is really helpful sometimes. And then there's two other senses that we don't always talk about. One of them is balance. So maintaining yourself in an upright or appropriate position and how you go about that also has to do with things like spinning and vestibular function, which is the part of your inner ear that controls your balance. So balance is its own sense. And then there's this other sense that we call proprioception, which is a nice word for understanding where your body is relative to all of your other body parts and other objects. So is my arm up or down? How far up? Is it so far up that I'm going to hit the cabinet over my head? That kind of thing. That's proprioception. Completely different sense, which brings us to a total of 8 different senses. We as human beings use those 8 senses to gather data about our world and learn. We also use it to keep our brain processing. Human beings do not do well in a state where they receive no sensory input at all. There are things called sensory deprivation tanks. I think this sounds awful, but it's like a tank full of water in total darkness and you kind of float, and it mostly just deprives you of all of your senses. And most people go crazy in like 20 minutes because it's a really uncomfortable feeling. Kids who grow up without enough sensory input grow up with a certain set of problems. So if we think about orphanages in other countries where the staff to child ratio is not appropriate, those kids can have some pretty serious behavioral issues. If you have too much sensory input coming in at any one time, it provokes a fight or flight response. So too little is bad for you, but a lot is not always real great either. Too much sensory input is perceived as a danger signal by your body, and you will kick on a fight or flight response that will not shut off until the sensory overload goes away. It doesn't have to go away entirely, but you need to decrease the sensory input before that fight or flight will go away. This is not a disorder. This is my explanation of how your brain functions. Everybody's brain does this. Everybody's brain has a threshold below which they get no sensory input and above which their sensory system goes into overload. Everybody has a good range somewhere in the middle where we're happy and healthy. Think about sensory data the same way you think about food, okay? Your body hungers for food. If you are hungry and you are not getting enough food, good luck getting anything else done. Because until you fill your stomach, your brain's not going to move on to any other higher order thinking. It's not going to learn well. It's not going to work well. You're going to be super focused on food. Think about drinking. If you're super thirsty, are you thinking about anything else? Can you get anything else done? No. If you haven't slept, if you need sleep, you have the same problem. The same thing happens for someone who is not getting enough sensory input. I think of it kind of like a cup, and you got to fill that cup with sensory input, with data coming into your brain before you can move on to other activities. So we need sensory input the same way that we need food and we need sleep. It is a biological drive to get the right amount of sensory input. Not so much that we overload, but enough that our brain stays active and is able to focus. Otherwise we go a little crazy, honestly. It's a stir crazy feeling. It's very difficult to focus. It's a hunger, but it's a hunger for data, not a hunger for food. And if you think about it that way, this becomes a lot easier. So what is this thing that's called sensory processing disorder? So much like my dislike of the term attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, I'm not a big fan of the sensory processing disorder label, because these kids are not broken. These adults are not broken. They have thresholds for overload and data need that are different than other people's. But that's not broken, it's just different. It's a different way of processing. And there's a couple of different kinds of differences that you may recognize in your own child. Typically, these things become apparent in childhood. So if you're seeing them, or if this sounds like you as a kid, you may be identifying a person who has a sensory processing difference compared to most of the population. So I want you to think about hearing. We're going to talk about this in terms of hearing, and then we'll expand to the other senses, because I think the idea of volume is really important. So I think everybody knows somebody who has super sensitive hearing. So you're watching TV together and they cover their ears and say, oh my gosh, it's too loud. And you're like, I can barely hear it. And likewise, there's people who don't seem to get it unless it's super loud. Even if the noise actually hurts your ears, for them it's not enough. That can be about the way your ears function, but it can also be about the way your brain is processing the sound. Likewise, there are some kids who are super sensitive to other senses besides sound. So for them, a sound that you think is normal, their body responds to with pain. A light that doesn't bother you is painfully bright to them. It's like looking into the sun. A smell that you can't even smell makes them sick to their stomach. A movement that doesn't bother you at all makes them feel sick or unstable. And so these people, these sensory sensitive folks, tend to try to avoid things that cause them pain, like we all do, right? We all avoid things that cause us pain. These folks avoid things that cause them pain, and when they come into contact with those sensory experiences that are painful for them, they kick into fight or flight mode, and it becomes very difficult for them to do anything else. If you've ever been in Peter Piper and have seen a kid have a total meltdown the minute they walk in the door, it may have been because that kid is sensory sensitive, and that is the loudest, flashiest lighting place I can think of. If you're someone who's sensory sensitive, that stuff is going to put it's painful for you. It's literally painful. And so you're going to go into fight or flight. It's what's going to happen. It's what your brain is designed to do. We all can hit that point with sensory input. It's just that some people hit it at lower levels. They hit it at a lower volume than other people do. It's not just sound. It can be touch and deep pressure and all kinds of things, but it's still the volume of the sensory input. It's the brightness of the sensory input. It's the intensity. They perceive intensity that most of the rest of us don't perceive. Likewise, there's another group of people who, for whatever reason, don't perceive things the same way the rest of us do. They're a little bit on the other side. They need to turn up the volume in order to be able to gather that sensory data. Not just on sound, but on things like touch and deep pressure and that balance and proprioception stuff. They need more stimulus in those areas than anybody else does, than other people do. in order to fill that cup, in order to satisfy that hunger for data, they need to do more to fill that cup. Just like people have different metabolisms, people have different needs for amount of sensory data. And just like you can overload the sensitive folks, you can deprive the low sensitivity folks by not giving them enough. And that also creates behavior problems. Those kids get stir crazy. They get to the point where they're starving for that data and they act out accordingly. So what does this look like in real life? So if you have a sensory seeking child or a low sensitivity child, meaning they don't pick up on stuff right away, you're going to see a certain set of behaviors. These are kids who crave data input. So the kids who need deep pressure input to fill that cup, these are the kids who crash into furniture and other people somewhat intentionally, because that's what they need to feel that pressure. Just the gentle touch doesn't do it. It doesn't register. It doesn't fill that cup. They need the harder impact. These are kids who jump all the time. Kids who spin all the time are craving that balance and vestibular piece. Kids who like to be upside down, who will lay on the couch with their head hanging off the edge, watching TV upside down. Kids who are super comfortable in that position may be craving proprioception input. These kids will do very physical things over and over and over again to continue to try to get that input and fill that cup. If kids have this problem with smell and taste where they're sensory seeking, it's not as weird to us because it's not as obvious, but the body movements of the kids who are craving the physical stuff really can create some stress for parents, because these kids are constantly on the go. They're wild. They're everywhere all at once because their little brains are driving them to pull in data however they can, data that they recognize as being appropriate in volume, trying to fill that cup before they're going to be able to move on to other stuff. Sensory avoidant kids, or the really, really sensitive kids, are going to do just that. They're going to avoid certain stimulus, and they're going to freak out if that stimulus surprises them. These are kids who, no matter what age, still hate the vacuum cleaner and the blender, and it scares them every single time. These are kids who are scared by dogs barking. Not just any dogs, even their own dogs, the dogs they've lived with their whole life. If the dog barks, they're going to startle. These are children who, when you try to lay them back to change their diaper, they have a panicky response. That has to do with their balance and proprioception. These are kids who are super unsteady on their feet. They always want to have a hand on a wall or on a piece of furniture. That's a balance sensitivity. There are kids who just don't like to be touched, because what you intend as a gentle touch for them is painfully hard. They feel pain. It's painful. The bright lights and the loud noises and the touch, all of it, while you don't intend it to be painful, it is felt as pain in that child. So we end up, and then this is really where it gets fun, because some kids are mixed. So they'll be sensory seeking in one area and sensory avoidant in other areas because they're super sensitive about those things. So one of my kiddos is extremely sound sensitive, but sensory seeking in physical movement. So you kind of have to tailor what you're doing with this kid to make sure that he's getting all of his needs met, and at the same time, we're not causing him pain unexpectedly. How do you deal with this? Because, so you understand how it works, but what does that mean for parents and for therapists who work with these kids? So, the sensitive kids. Look, if you're a parent, you would never intentionally inflict pain on your child. Likewise, we shouldn't expose our sensitive kids to painful stimulus, to overload. unless it's necessary. And I don't mean convenient, I mean necessary. So I've heard parents talk about, well, he just needs to get used to it. Okay, that's fine. How about this? How about if I hit you with a hammer in the head a couple times and I'll tell you you need to get used to it? Because that's what your sensory sensitive child feels when he hears those loud noises that hurt him. So you attempting to desensitize your child just by throwing them out there, for some kids it works, for some kids it's a disaster because you're causing them pain intentionally. And it's not really okay. Your occupational therapist, your special education teachers can work with desensitization, but it is a very slow process, and it is driven at the child's pace, not at the pace that the adult wants it to go at. It's completely driven by that kid. So I do not recommend that parents attempt desensitization without guidance, because you will cause your child pain. And as a parent, that's never our goal. What parents of sensitive kids need to understand is that they need to adapt a little bit of how they approach the world to adjust for their child's sensitivity. And I know that it sounds like we're babying the child, but the truth is, when this child grows up, he's still going to be sensory sensitive. That does not go away. It's always going to be there. But adults modify their lives to adjust for their sensitivities. If loud music bothers an adult, we just don't go to concerts. We adjust the TV to be at a comfortable volume. We don't go to loud parties because we have that choice as grown-ups. As children, we are very much subjected to whatever our parents think is okay, and what that leads to in a sensory sensitive child is a total meltdown. Your child's not being bad, they're in pain. Try not to inflict pain. If there are events you have to attend that you know are going to trigger your child's sensitivity, it's okay to take action to lessen that and still take them with you. I'm not telling you to avoid all outside activity because you have a sensory sensitive child. But what I'm saying is, if you're going to go to Peter Piper and your kid is sound sensitive, take earplugs. Because even that muffled noise will keep your child calmer, because it won't be painful for them, and it's a really simple integration. There are movie theaters that do sensory sensitive showings where the volume's lower and the lights are on and it's not so intense, so kids can sit and enjoy a movie without being overwhelmed by the theater experience. That's the kind of modifications we're talking about. Work with your kid, figure out where their sensitive points are, and try to help them figure out a way to adapt to the real world without causing themselves unnecessary pain. That's the battle of the sensitive child. The seeking child is a completely different experience. So if your child is a sensory seeker, you're going to want this kid to be able to sit still in school, to be able to do activities with you, to play matching games or whatever. And that's all reasonable. However, your child is going to need to fill that sensory cup before we go any further in learning. You're going to have to fill the cup. So this means intentionally programming into your day activities that address your child's specific seeking needs. So if you've got a kid that craves deep touch and impact, get a trampoline. The little 3-foot ones, don't go crazy. But let them jump for half an hour before you sit down and read a book. Let them kind of get all that pressure. Weighted blankets are helpful because they provide that deep pressure your child needs. Now that cup is full and your child's able to focus on other stuff, which is great, because that's really our goal here, is to get kids to learn. And it can be very difficult when they're starving for data, and they're starving for a very particular kind of data. They're not getting it through the educational experience, and they're not paying attention. What we want is to fill that cup so your sensory seeking child can begin to move on to higher order thinking. They can do more grown up, more big kid stuff, but you got to fill the cup first. I recommend that you work with an occupational therapist to really pin down what things you can do to address your child's specific sensory needs. Because like I said, while I'm talking about these kids like they're two different kinds of kids, the truth is that most kids I know are blended. So they've got their sensitivities and they have their seeking behaviors, and you as a parent are going to end up working with an occupational therapist potentially to try to give the input your child really needs and modify the input that they find painful in order to keep them functional and happy. Because the goal here is to keep your kid functional and happy, engaged in the world, able to get through school, able to do all the things that they need to do. And in order to do that, you need to, number one, fill that data cup in their head in order to get them to think so they can think straight. And number two is teach them how to avoid things that are going to trigger a fight or flight response in them, either through desensitization with a professional. Again, please don't do this by yourself, because I don't want you to cause your child pain, and I'm pretty sure you don't want to either. Or modifying activities in order to reduce the pain levels for the child. Again, I can't call this a disorder in good faith, because these kids aren't broken. They just have different sensory perceptions than the rest of us do. And we, as the adults in their lives, need to teach them to work with their gifts and their deficits to live a happy, productive life. Addressing sensory processing differences is one of the ways that we can give a kid a step up when they start school, because you're already going to know how to get your kid to pay attention. And there's even modifications in classrooms to allow for sensory processing differences and keeping kids engaged. And that's your IEPs and your 504 plans. So if your kid's got a sensory processing problem, talk to the teacher about what you can modify to keep your kid engaged. If you think your child has a sensory processing problem, your first stop is your pediatrician. But I will also tell you that the training that we get on sensory processing differences, and even sensory processing in children itself, is really limited. So the folks who know the most about it are the ones who professionally, intentionally went out and sought out more information. If your doctor has no idea what you're talking about, you can request a referral to occupational therapy and work with that therapist and your doctor to come up with a plan that works for you. I should also tell you that this sensory processing thing is really slow going. You're not going to figure it all out and suddenly your child's never going to melt down. You're not going to figure it all out and suddenly your child will be able to pay attention well whenever you want them to. It's a process. Sometimes what works one day isn't going to work the next day. Sometimes things change. And keeping reasonable expectations of not only your child, but also yourself is really important here. Because you can begin to feel like kind of a failure if you have trouble reducing those sensory-induced meltdowns. I suggest for most parents that if your child is having sensory problems, that you keep a log. Keep a meltdown log. So my meltdown logs look like this. They have essentially every day of the week. I want to know what happens every day. And every time there's a meltdown, I want to know what happened before that meltdown, what your child did during the meltdown, and then what your child did after. What was the consequence of that meltdown? Did they get attention? Did they have to leave a place? Whatever. So that we can look back through and figure out what the triggers are if your child is seeking or avoiding, and what we maybe can do to change the experience for your child to avoid both pain and sensory deprivation, because both of those are bad. We're trying to keep your kid in the middle. I'm happy to send you a copy of my sensory processing log that I give out to patients. If you'd like it, just let me know, PM me or whatever, and we'll set up a way to exchange it. If you've got questions about sensory processing, how kids process, why they process the way they do, how you can help intervene and make your child learning experience better, let me know. I'm happy to sit down and talk to you guys about it. Otherwise, I hope this was helpful. I think it's an easily misunderstood topic, and I want parents to know that it's normal. It's just one more thing that makes your kiddo special, and we can work with your child to help make life go more smoothly for you. Please let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, I will talk to you all again later. Bye.